The Atlanta Municipal Court's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across courtroom 4B as the heavy oak doors burst open at 9:15 a.m. Sarah Washington rushed in, still wearing navy blue surgical scrubs with visible bloodstains on the sleeve, remnants of the emergency that had delayed her court appearance. The room's musty air, thick with tension and bureaucracy, seemed to pause as heads turned toward the interruption. Judge Michael Bennett's steel-gray eyes narrowed at his watch, then at the tardiness before him. His reputation as the Hammer preceded him through whispered conversations in courthouse corridors, earned through years of rigid adherence to protocol and unforgiving sentencing. Today had already tried his patience, 3 no-shows and a belligerent DUI defendant. And now this. Mrs. Washington, the court clerk announced, her voice carrying a note of sympathy that Judge Bennett chose to ignore. The judge's hands tensed around his gavel, knuckles whitening slightly as he observed the disheveled woman approaching the defendant's podium. Her hospital ID badge swung wildly from her neck, the plastic catching the fluorescent glare with each hurried step. "Your Honor, I apologize for my late arrival," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her breathlessness. "There was an emergency at Atlanta General." "This court's time is valuable, Mrs. Washington," Judge Bennett interrupted, his words crisp and cold. "Your scheduled appearance was for 9:00 a.m. We've held up proceedings for 15 minutes. He shuffled through the papers before him, barely glancing at the woman standing mere feet away. "You're here for a speeding violation, recorded at 47 miles per hour in a 30 zone on Brunswick Avenue." Sarah straightened her spine, composure emanating from her despite the chaos evident in her appearance. "Yes, Your Honor. If I may explain. The citation clearly states you were clocked at 1:45 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon," Bennett continued, speaking over her attempted explanation. "This wasn't an emergency vehicle responding to a crisis. This was a civilian choosing to endanger others by exceeding the speed limit by more than 15 miles per hour in a residential area." In the gallery, a young public defender named Marcus Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, his pen scratching against his notepad. He'd watched Judge Bennett handle dozens of traffic violations, but something about this interaction felt different, harsher, more dismissive than usual. Sarah's hands, steady from years of performing delicate medical procedures, gripped the podium. Small flecks of dried blood under her fingernails caught the light, evidence of the life she'd helped save just 30 minutes ago. "Your Honor, I've been an ER nurse for 20 years. This morning, I was rushing to." "Your occupation is irrelevant to these proceedings, Mrs. Washington," Bennett cut in again, his tone suggesting the conversation was nearing its end. "The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their profession." A subtle murmur rippled through the courtroom. The irony of his words wasn't lost on the regular attendees who'd witnessed far more lenient treatment of other defendants, particularly those who arrived in suits rather than scrubs, or whose skin tone matched the judge's own. Sarah took a deep breath, the kind she used before dealing with difficult patients or delivering hard news to families. "I understand, Your Honor. However, I'd like to point out that this is my first traffic violation in 20 years of driving. I'm asking the court to consider that you're asking us to excuse dangerous behavior." Bennett's voice carried the finality of a closing door. "The court sees no extenuating circumstances that would justify reducing the standard penalty for this violation." The blood on Sarah's scrubs had come from a cardiac arrest patient, a grandfather of 3 who'd collapsed in his garden. She performed CPR for 28 minutes, refusing to give up until his heart started beating again. That same determination now showed in her eyes as she stood before Judge Bennett, facing a different kind of injustice. The young public defender's pen moved faster now, documenting every word, every interruption, every dismissal. In his 2 years of observing Judge Bennett's courtroom, something about this case felt wrong enough to warrant detailed notes. Sarah's hospital ID badge displayed her credentials. Sarah Washington, RN, BSN, Emergency Department Team Lead. But Judge Bennett never bothered to look close enough to read it. His gavel was already rising, judgment prepared before she'd even finished speaking. Judge Bennett's gavel struck with practiced precision, the sharp crack echoing through courtroom 4B, $300 and mandatory traffic school. He pronounced, each word falling like another blow. Plus court fees. The fine was notably higher than typical for a first-time speeding offense, a fact not lost on the now silent gallery. Sarah Washington's fingers curled tighter around the podium, her knuckles whitening against the dark wood. 20 years of handling life-and-death situations in the ER had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, but this was testing her limits. The dried blood on her scrubs felt heavy now, a reminder of the morning's emergency that Judge Bennett had so casually dismissed. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used when directing trauma teams, "I'd like to request a payment plan. As a single mother." "The court is not interested in personal circumstances, Mrs. Washington," Bennett interrupted, already shuffling papers for the next case. "Payment is due within 30 days. He didn't bother looking up as he added, "Failure to comply will result in additional penalties." In the third row of the gallery, Public Defender Marcus Rodriguez's pen moved furiously across his legal pad. Subject repeatedly interrupted, dismissed mitigating factors, clear deviation from standard fine structure. He muttered under his breath. The young lawyer had watched Bennett handle dozens of similar cases, often reducing fines for defendants who arrived in business suits with private attorneys at their sides. The court clerk, Linda Martins, shifted uncomfortably at her desk. In 15 years of service, she'd developed an instinct for injustice. She'd seen Judge Bennett waive fees just last week for a white businessman who'd been caught doing 55 in a school zone. That defendant had joked about his lead foot, and Bennett had chuckled along with him. Sarah straightened her spine, her 5'6" frame somehow filling the space with quiet dignity. The fluorescent lights caught the silver threads in her dark hair, earned through years of night shifts and overtime. "I understand, Your Honor. However, I would like to formally note my objection to what appears to be an excessive penalty for a first offense." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Bennett finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. "Are you questioning this court's authority, Mrs. Washington?" "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I'm questioning its fairness." A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. Even the bailiff, typically stoic, raised his eyebrows. Rodriguez's pen paused mid-sentence, and Linda Martinez accidentally dropped her stack of files, the sound of shuffling papers breaking the tense silence. Bennett's face flushed slightly, a vein pulsing at his temple. "Mrs. Washington, you're dangerously close to contempt. Would you like to add that to today's charges?" Sarah's response was measured, each word carefully chosen. "I apologize if my words offend, Your Honor. I merely wish to ensure the record reflects my concern about the severity of this punishment relative to similar cases." In the gallery, Rodriguez smiled slightly. She was smart. Her words were a perfect setup for a potential appeal, stating her objection for the record without crossing any lines that could justify additional charges. "The record will reflect," Bennett said icily, "that you were found guilty of reckless endangerment of public safety, and that the court deemed the punishment appropriate to the offense." His gavel rose again. "Next case." Sarah gathered her belongings, a worn leather purse, and the stethoscope she hadn't had time to leave at the hospital. As she turned to leave, Linda Martinez caught her eye and gave a subtle, sympathetic nod. The clerk had already decided to slip a payment plan application into the case file, despite the judge's ruling. Walking down the courthouse steps minutes later, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her son. "Made the winning shot at practice. Mom. Coach says we're ready for finals." A small smile softened her features as she typed back a quick response, her anger temporarily overshadowed by maternal pride. Behind her, through the courthouse windows, Rodriguez was already pulling Sarah's case file, his young face set with determination. Sometimes, he reflected, Justice needed a second chance to get things right. He just hoped Mrs. Washington would be willing to fight for that chance. The Anderson High School gymnasium vibrated with pre-game energy as Judge Michael Bennett settled into his usual spot in the bleachers, third row from the bottom, just behind the home team bench. The familiar squeak of basketball shoes against polished hardwood and the rhythmic thump of practice balls provided a welcome contrast to the day's tense courtroom proceedings. "Evening, Your Honor," called out Principal Williams, making his way through the crowded stands. "Big game tonight, state semifinals on the line." He gestured toward the court where the team was warming up, their navy and gold jerseys blurring with movement. "Your Kevin and Marcus have been absolutely unstoppable this season." Bennett beamed with pride as he watched his son Kevin running drills with his best friend Marcus Washington. The two boys moved with synchronized grace, products of a friendship forged through years of shared practices and weekend games. At 6'2", Marcus stood 3 inches taller than Kevin, but they matched each other in skill and determination. "Marcus has got another scholarship offer," Principal Williams continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Stanford's interested now, too. Between his academic record and basketball performance, he could pretty much take his pick." "That boy's something special," Bennett agreed, watching Marcus sink a perfect three-pointer. "Did you see his latest SAT scores? Wouldn't have believed it if Kevin hadn't shown me himself. Perfect math section." He shook his head in admiration, and still finds time to volunteer at that youth basketball program he started. The bleachers continued filling up as tip-off approached. Bennett recognized half the faces in the crowd: parents, teachers, and community members who'd been following this remarkable team's journey. Marcus Washington had become something of a local legend, not just for his athletic prowess, but for his leadership on and off the court. "Dad." Kevin jogged over during a break in warm-ups, his face flushed with excitement. "Marcus just heard back from Harvard. They want him to visit campus next month." He wiped sweat from his forehead with his jersey. "Think you could look over his application essay this weekend? You know, since you went there." Bennett nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. Anything to help." He'd already written a glowing recommendation letter for Marcus, drawing on 3 years of watching the young man's influence on his own son. Under Marcus's friendship, Kevin had transformed from a B student with disciplinary issues to a focused athlete with honor roll grades. The referee's whistle cut through the gym's chaos, signaling 5 minutes until game time. As Kevin rushed back to join his team, Bennett caught sight of Marcus giving a quick pep talk to the younger players. The boy carried himself with a natural dignity that reminded Bennett of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. "Leadership comes naturally to that one," commented Coach Thompson, who'd appeared courtside. "Never seen anything like it in 30 years of coaching." Yesterday, he organized a study group for the freshman players who were struggling with chemistry, got the whole team involved. The opposing team filed onto the court, their red jerseys a stark contrast to Anderson High's navy blue. They were bigger, more physically imposing, but Bennett wasn't worried. He'd watched Marcus and Kevin outsmart bigger teams all season. As the players took their positions for tip-off, Marcus glanced toward the stands, scanning the crowd. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face before he reset his game expression. Bennett had seen this before, the boy looking for someone who never seemed to make it to the games. "Shane, his mom works such long hours," Coach Thompson said, following Bennett's gaze. "Hospital schedules are brutal. But man, that woman raised him right. Single mom, putting him through private school, never missed a parent-teacher conference, even if she had to come straight from a shift." The referee's whistle blew again. Marcus took his position at center court, his jersey number 23 gleaming under the gymnasium lights. As the ball rose into the air, Bennett felt the usual surge of pride. He'd watched this kid grow up alongside his son, had him over for countless dinners, helped him with college applications. In that moment, just before the game began, Judge Michael Bennett considered himself an excellent judge of character. After all, he'd recognized Marcus's potential from the start. The irony of that thought wouldn't hit him until much later. Victory celebrations at Marino's Diner had been an Anderson High basketball tradition for decades. The small family-owned restaurant buzzed with energy as players, parents, and fans packed into red vinyl booths and around Formica tables, riding the high of their 72-68 win. The smell of victory mixed with the aroma of fresh-baked apple pie and burning coffee. Judge Bennett sat in his usual corner booth, watching his son Kevin recount the game's final moments to an enthusiastic audience. The boy's face was still flushed with excitement, his navy blue jersey wrinkled from countless victory hugs. Marcus stood beside him, adding modest corrections whenever Kevin exaggerated the tale. And then Marcus, you should have seen it. He fakes left, spins right, and just floats through the air like gravity doesn't exist. Kevin's hands moved wildly, illustrating the play. 3 seconds left. Defenders all over him, and swish, nothing but net. It was more like a lucky shot. Marcus chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. Plus, your pass is what made it possible. Bennett smiled into his coffee cup. Marcus's humility was one of the many qualities he admired about the boy. He'd often told his colleagues that Marcus Washington was proof that some kids just raised themselves right, no matter their circumstances. The thought had barely finished forming when the diner's bell chimed. Mom. Marcus's face lit up. You made it. Bennett's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Through the crowd of Letterman jackets and cheerleader uniforms, he watched Sarah Washington make her way toward their corner. She'd changed out of her scrubs into clean clothes, but he recognized her instantly. The same dignified posture, the same determined walk, the same face that had stood before his bench just hours ago. Sorry I'm late, baby, Sarah said, wrapping Marcus in a tight hug. Had to finish my shift paperwork. She turned to Kevin with equal warmth. Great game, Kevin. That assist was beautiful. Mrs. Washington. Kevin beamed. Did you see the final play? Marcus was incredible. I caught the last quarter from the doorway. She smiled. Didn't want to interrupt by trying to find a seat. Bennett's mind raced through the day's events like a rewinding tape. The blood-stained scrubs. A hospital ID badge. The 20 years of clean driving record. The way he'd dismissed her explanation about rushing to work. Each memory struck him like a physical blow. Dad. Kevin's voice cut through his spiral. Come meet Marcus's mom. She's the one who's been helping me with my biology homework. Did you know she's a trauma nurse? She's basically saved like 1 million lives. Sarah turned, and their eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something harder to read. The diner's cheerful atmosphere seemed to fade into background static as judge and defendant faced each other in a very different context. Judge Bennett, she said, her voice carrying the same composed dignity it had in his courtroom. What an unexpected pleasure. Mrs. Washington, he managed, his throat suddenly dry. I didn't realize that I was Marcus's mother. The corner of her mouth turned up slightly, or that I was more than just another case number. Kevin and Marcus exchanged confused looks. Wait, you two know each other? Marcus asked. We met briefly this morning, Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving Bennett's face. The judge was helping me understand the importance of following traffic laws. The weight of the $300 fine and mandatory traffic school hung in the air between them. Bennett thought about the recommendation letter he'd written for Marcus, praising the boy's character and the strong values he must have learned at home. He thought about all the dinners Marcus had eaten at his table while his mother worked night shifts at the hospital. He thought about how quickly he'd dismissed her in court, never once really seeing her. Marcus, Sarah said, finally breaking their eye contact, why don't you and Kevin grab us some menace? I believe Judge Bennett, and I have some matters to discuss. As the boys walked away, Bennett noticed his coffee cup was still suspended halfway to his mouth. He carefully set it down, his hand trembling slightly. The ticking of the diner's neon clock seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence between them. At 2:47 a.m., Judge Michael Bennett sat alone in his chambers, the harsh glow of his computer monitor cutting through the darkness. The security footage from Courtroom 4B played on repeat, each viewing revealing new layers of his own prejudice that turned his stomach. The court is not interested in personal circumstances, Mrs. Washington, his recorded voice echoed through the speakers. He watched himself shuffle papers, refusing to even look at her as she stood before him. The blood on her scrubs was clearly visible in the high-definition footage, evidence of a life saved, dismissed without a thought. He paused the video, focusing on Sarah Washington's face. The same quiet dignity she'd shown at Marino's diner was there in the courtroom, hours before he knew she was Marcus's mother. Hours before he knew she was the woman who'd taught his son advanced biology on weekends, who'd nursed Kevin back to health during flu season, who'd spent countless nights helping both boys with their college applications. His phone buzzed, making him jump. A text from Kevin lit up the screen. "Dad, guess what? Mrs. Washington helped me finish my Harvard application essay. She stayed up after her night shift to edit it. She's basically Superwoman. Marcus is so lucky." Bennett's hand trembled as he set the phone down. He minimized the security footage and pulled up his email, finding the recommendation letter he'd written for Marcus just last week. His own words mocked him. Marcus Washington represents the very best of his generation. His extraordinary character speaks to the exceptional upbringing and values instilled in him at home. The irony made him sick. He praised the results of Sarah Washington's parenting while treating her with contempt in his own courtroom. The same woman he dismissed as just another traffic violator had been shaping his own son's character for years. Unable to sit still, Bennett paced his chambers. The walls, lined with law degrees and accolades, seemed to judge him now. His eyes fell on a framed photo of Kevin and Marcus at their junior year basketball banquet. Sarah Washington stood in the background, her smile proud but tired, probably coming off another hospital shift. He returned to his desk and pulled up Mrs. Washington's case file. Her driving record was immaculate. Not even a parking ticket in 20 years. The speeding violation occurred on Brunswick Avenue, the direct route between her house and Atlanta General Hospital. The time stamp on her citation matched the emergency room records, exactly 17 minutes before a cardiac arrest patient was admitted. A patient who lived. The night cleaning lady, Mrs. Rodriguez, knocked gently on his door. "Judge Bennett, I'm sorry, but I need to clean in here." "Of course, Maria. I apologize." He started gathering his things, then paused. "Maria, your son went to Anderson High, didn't he?" "Yes, sir. Graduated last year." Did you ever feel like the system treated you differently? Because of who you are?" Maria's hand stilled on her cleaning cart. "Judge Bennett, I've cleaned these chambers for 15 years. This is the first time you've asked me anything about myself." The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. How many others had he looked past? How many stories had he dismissed? How many Sarah Washingtons had stood before him, seen but never truly acknowledged? His phone buzzed again. Another text from Kevin. "Mom's making Sunday dinner tomorrow. Marcus says Mrs. Washington insists you come too. She says we have matters to discuss. Should I be worried?" Bennett stared at the message for a long moment. In the security footage still playing silently on his monitor, Sarah Washington gathered her belongings with quiet grace, her hospital ID badge catching the light as she turned to leave his courtroom. "No," he typed back to Kevin, "but I am." He shut down his computer and gathered his coat. Tomorrow would bring its own reckoning, but tonight had given him something crucial, the beginning of understanding. As he left his chambers, he noticed Maria Rodriguez's name tag for the first time in 15 years. Saturday morning found Judge Bennett in the courthouse archives, surrounded by towering shelves of case files and the musty scent of legal history. He'd arrived when the doors opened at 8 a.m., using his judicial access to dive deep into records that most people never saw. Now, 6 hours later, the story of Sarah Washington emerged from countless documents spread across his research table. "Judge," the archives clerk, Dorothy Mills, approached with another stack of papers. I found those hospital board records you requested, and—" She hesitated. "There's something else you should see." She placed a yellowed newspaper clipping on top of the pile. The headline read, "ER Nurse Saves Judge's Life in Courtroom Drama." The photo showed a younger Sarah Washington performing CPR on Judge Theodore Martinez, who had collapsed during proceedings 3 years ago. Bennett remembered hearing about the incident, but he'd never connected it to the woman who stood in his courtroom just days ago. "She's quite remarkable," Dorothy said softly. "Been here 30 years, seen all types come through those courts. Some people, they just shine different." Bennett nodded, unable to speak as he read through Sarah's accomplishments. The hospital board citations painted a picture of excellence. Pioneering a community health program in underserved neighborhoods, mentoring minority nursing students, establishing a free clinic that operated on weekends, all while raising Marcus alone after her husband's death in the line of duty as a firefighter. His hands trembled as he opened another file. Inside was a letter Marcus had written for a scholarship application, dated just last month. "My mother taught me that justice isn't just a word in a courtroom. It's an action we choose every day. When I watch her work 30-hour shifts to afford my education, or stop to help accident victims even when she's off duty, I understand what real integrity looks like. She's shown me that true character isn't about what you do when everyone's watching, but about the choices you make when no one sees you at all." The irony of those words struck Bennett like a physical blow. He thought about his own son, Kevin, who'd grown into a thoughtful young man largely due to Sarah Washington's influence. How many times had she fed him dinner, helped with his homework, or tended to his injuries, all while working double shifts to support her own son? A citation for community service caught his eye. Last Christmas, Sarah had organized a free health screening event at the homeless shelter. The date stuck out. December 24th, the same night Bennett had hosted a lavish holiday party where he bragged about Marcus's Harvard acceptance to his colleagues. "Your Honor," Dorothy's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's a character reference here from Judge Martinez, written after the courtroom incident." The letter was brief but powerful. "Mrs. Washington didn't just save my life. She reminded me why we serve. In those critical moments, she saw no race, no class, no status. She saw a human being in need. Would that our justice system could claim the same." Bennett's throat tightened. He thought of Sarah standing before him in his courtroom, still wearing the scrubs that proved she'd just saved another life. He'd seen the blood, seen her hospital ID, heard her attempted explanation, and he'd dismissed it all with the casual arrogance of privilege unchecked. His phone buzzed. A text from Kevin. "Dad, don't forget, dinner at Marcus's house tomorrow. Mrs. Washington makes the best pot roast." Another document caught his attention. A property tax assessment showing Sarah had taken a second mortgage on her house to pay for Marcus's private school tuition. The date aligned perfectly with the timing of her new position as night shift supervisor, a role that paid more but demanded brutal hours. "Judge Bennett." Dorothy stood in the archive doorway. "We're closing in 15 minutes. He nodded, gathering the documents with shaking hands. The paper trail told a story of sacrifice, dignity, and unfailing service to others, a story he'd been too blind to see from his elevated bench. Tomorrow's dinner loomed before him like a reckoning. He had much to answer for, and even more to learn. The Atlanta General Hospital cafeteria hummed with mid-afternoon activity as Judge Michael Bennett stood in the entrance, still wearing his court robes. He'd come straight from chambers, unable to wait any longer for this conversation. Through the bustling crowd of medical staff, he spotted Sarah Washington at a corner table, surgical scrubs fresh, clearly just out of an emergency procedure. 3 minutes, she was saying to a younger nurse. That's all you've got between identifying a stroke and preventing permanent damage. Every second. She stopped mid-sentence, noticing Bennett's approach. We'll continue this later, Amy. The younger nurse scurried away, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Around them, Conversations dulled to whispers as hospital staff recognized the judge's robes. Sarah remained seated, her half-eaten salad forgotten, eyes steady on Bennett's face. "Mrs. Washington," he began, his rehearsed speech evaporating under her gaze. "Judge Bennett." Her voice carried the same quiet dignity it had in his courtroom. "I assume this isn't about Marcus's recommendation letter." He stood awkwardly, aware of the eyes watching them. "May I?" He gestured to the empty chair. "It's a free country." A pause. "At least, that's what they tell us." Bennett sat, his judicial robes suddenly feeling heavy and out of place among the medical scrubs and white coats. Through the cafeteria windows, afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across their table. A silent moment stretched between them. "I spent last night reviewing your case file," he finally said. "My case file?" Sarah's eyebrow arched slightly. "Or my life file?" "Because there's a difference, Your Honor, though you might have missed it from up on that bench." Her words landed like precise incisions. Bennett thought of the documents he'd discovered. The Community Service Awards, the second mortgage, the letters from grateful patients. "I owe you more than an apology," he managed. "I don't want your apology," Sarah replied, her voice low but firm. "I want your understanding of why you never saw me as a person until you knew I was Marcus's mother." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what I was doing when I got that speeding ticket?" Bennett nodded, remembering the hospital records. "Responding to a cardiac emergency." The patient lived. James Martinez, father of 3, Puerto Rican immigrant who works 2 jobs. Sarah's eyes never left his face. When he collapsed in his garden, his daughter called 911. "I was off duty. Heard the call on my emergency scanner. The ambulance was 12 minutes out. Brain death begins at 4. Bennett felt the weight of every wrong assumption he'd made that day in court. "You were trying to tell me." "I was trying to tell you many things, Your Honor, but you weren't interested in hearing from someone who looked like me." She gestured to a group of doctors passing their table. "Would you have treated Dr. Richards there the same way? He speeds through that same school zone every morning in his Tesla. But I guess his rush to get to his private practice is more important than my rush to save lives." The truth of her words stung. Bennett thought of all the times he'd reduced fines for professionals in suits, all the times he'd accepted explanations from people who looked more like him. I've been part of the problem." "You've been the problem," Sarah corrected. "But recognizing that is the first step toward being part of the solution." She checked her pager as it buzzed. "I have surgery in 20 minutes. A kid from Marcus's school, basketball injury." As she stood to leave, Bennett found his voice again. "How do you do it? Care for everyone equally, even after people like me treat you this way." Sarah paused, gathering her medical charts. "Because unlike some, Your Honor, I took an oath to help people, and actually meant it." Her face softened slightly. "Sunday dinner is at 6. Don't be late. Marcus and Kevin are grilling, and you know how boys can get carried away." She turned to go, then looked back one last time. "Oh, and Judge Bennett, that traffic fine you imposed. I donated the same amount to the hospital's Minority Nursing Scholarship Fund. Sometimes justice needs a little redirection." Bennett watched her walk away, her head high, her steps purposeful. Through the cafeteria windows, the afternoon sun caught her hospital ID badge, making it shine like a beacon of truth in a world that desperately needed more light. 6 months later, Courtroom 4B had transformed. Gone was the intimidating silence, replaced by a different kind of judicial atmosphere. Judge Michael Bennett sat at his bench, but the rigid formality had softened into something more human. "Good morning, Ms. Rodriguez," he addressed the young woman before him, a traffic violation case similar to Sarah Washington's. "Before we proceed, tell me 3 things about yourself and why you were speeding that day." The gallery whispered in approval. The judge's new 3-question rule had become famous throughout the Atlanta legal community. Some critics called it too lenient, but the statistics spoke for themselves. Repeat offenses down 60%, community trust up, and a sharp decline in racial disparities in sentencing. From her seat on the County Judicial Review Board, Sarah Washington watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Her appointment had raised eyebrows initially, a nurse on a judicial board, but her perspective had proven invaluable in reforming the system from within. "Your Honor," Ms. Rodriguez explained, "I'm a single mother of two, working as a teacher's aide. I was rushing to pick up my son who had an asthma attack at school." She held up an emergency room receipt. Dr. Washington treated him at Atlanta General. Bennett nodded, remembering his own journey to understanding. Motion to reduce the fine granted, with community service at the school's after-school program instead. He looked directly at Ms. Rodriguez. "But let's work on getting you an emergency plan for your son that doesn't involve speeding, shall we?" During the lunch recess, Sarah met Bennett in his chambers. The space had changed too. Family photos now shared wall space with his legal credentials, including a new one. A certificate of completion from the Racial Equity in Judicial Practice program he'd not only attended but now helped teach. "The graduation ceremony starts at 4, Sarah reminded him, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Marcus and Kevin are already arguing about whose valedictorian speech will be better." Bennett smiled, remembering how far they'd all come. Co-valedictorians. Who would have thought? "I did," Sarah replied with a knowing look. "The day Kevin started coming to our house for study sessions, I told Marcus those two would push each other to excellence." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Linda Martinez, the court clerk, entered with a file. "Judge, the statistics you requested for the quarterly review." And Mrs. Washington, the hospital called. "They need you for the new Judicial Medical Liaison Program training." After Sarah left, Bennett reviewed the numbers. Each sheet told a story of change: reduced recidivism, increased community service participation, improved public trust in the courts. But the real changes couldn't be captured in statistics. Later that afternoon, as Marcus and Kevin stood together at the graduation podium, their words echoed through the packed auditorium. "Justice isn't just about laws," Marcus began. "It's about seeing each person's full humanity. Change isn't just about policies," Kevin continued. "It's about opening our hearts to perspectives different from our own." In the audience, Bennett and Sarah sat together, no longer judge and defendant, but partners in transformation. Their son's friendship had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths, but from that confrontation had grown something powerful, real change. After the ceremony, at the celebration dinner, Bennett raised his glass. "To our graduates, our future leaders, and to Sarah Washington, who taught me that true justice begins with seeing the person behind each case." Sarah smiled, adding her own toast. "To learning that sometimes the hardest cases teach us the most important lessons." As their extended families celebrated together, Bennett watched Sarah laugh with Kevin, who still called her his second mom. He thought about the day she'd stood in his courtroom, blood on her scrubs from saving a life, and how blind he'd been. The next morning, he'd returned to courtroom 4B, and she'd returned to the ER. But something fundamental had shifted in both spaces. Every defendant would be asked to share their story. Every case would be heard with new ears, and every judgment would be tempered with understanding. Justice, they had learned, was not just about following laws. It was about seeing, hearing, and honoring the humanity in each person who stepped into that courtroom. And sometimes, it took a judge being judged to understand that truth.